Hello. And recently I got a question on coffee cycles. So I decided to have a look at grains again, perhaps focusing a little bit more on coffee, as recently we did have a look at corn, wheat and soybeans. As I mentioned last time looking at corn, cycle by then was still pretty short. So while there was a bit of a chance that a cycle did finish in early May over here, there was also a pretty high chance, at least a 50% chance, that the cycle will continue down for at least a short while, and looks like that's exactly what happened. Now though, I think there is a pretty good chance the cycle finished in mid-May. We do have a bit of a positive divergence on RSI. That's a higher low on RSI versus lower low on price. This sort of positive divergence usually indicates a bit of a turnaround in momentum. We also see multiple pokes below relatively wide Bollinger Bands. Poking below wider and wider bands also does indicate a bit of a possible turnaround in momentum. Looking at cycles, usually corn cycles last for around 116 days, that's since mid-2020. So a cycle low over here on the 18th of May, implying a cycle lasting for around 66 days, is quite likely. At least that's not extremely far from that average of 116 days, and it's longer than the shortest cycle of 63 days since mid-2020. So while there is around 30% chance that the cycle continues lower for a cycle low with a duration even closer to an average, with the signs of a positive divergence poking below relatively wide Bollinger Bands, I do think there is probably at least 60% chance that a new cycle started a few days ago, so we'll likely see a trend upwards, but perhaps only over a short term, as corn is still pretty expensive looking over the last several years. At the same time, looking at wheat over longer term, wheat has already retraced much of its gains since the pandemic lows, while corn hasn't done so yet, so perhaps not much of a firework upwards, even if the cycle did finish a few days ago, maybe just a few days above the 50-day moving average, just as we usually see for a cycle top, before the cycle drops down again within its declining phase towards that new cycle low. Here's the optimism index on corn. We see that several days ago it did drop all the way down below that green line. Usually that indicates a bit of a buying opportunity. So this also suggests that we have seen a cycle low a few days ago. So I do expect a bit of a short-term bounce, perhaps sometime into mid-June. Next, moving on to wheat, we see a relatively similar situation with a positive divergence on RSI. Again, a high low on RSI, a slightly negligibly lower low on price, which actually happened pretty close to the average duration of these cycles, again, which usually lasts for 116 days. The low that took place a couple of days ago implies a 119-day long cycle. That's, again, pretty close, which tells me that it is quite likely we've just seen a cycle low and we're going to see a bit of a positive momentum perhaps over the next several weeks. Looking at optimism index for wheat, we also see a bit of a positive divergence over here, slightly higher low on this optics a couple of days ago against that previous recent low on wheat at the beginning of May. So again, positive divergences on RSI and optimism index, multiple pokes below relatively wide Bollinger Bands, and a low pretty close to the average duration of the cycle tells me that perhaps a new cycle is ready to start. But again, after such a decline, as I also mentioned in the previous video, it's probably gonna take a while for the market to digest this volatility. So I don't expect any fireworks higher from this cycle, perhaps more of a sideways move, maybe a bit of a rounded bottom from the longer term perspective, also as I've mentioned in the previous video. Next, soybeans. Last time we looked at it, the cycle was too short. We did expect soybeans to continue down into the cycle low. Now the recent low suggests a cycle lasting for 57 days. It's still pretty short, although we have multiple pokes below pretty wide Bollinger Bands. Our RSI was pretty low at 21.9 a few days ago, and the previous cycle was relatively long, so we might see a bit of a short cycle now to average out that duration, somewhere closer to that typical duration of 118 days since mid-2020. And similar to corn, if you zoom out all the way since the pandemic lows, soybeans have gained quite a lot. That's around 120% into the peak last year. So I think it's still gonna take a while to digest this. Hence, again, Even if we have seen the cycle low a few days ago, which we probably have, I don't expect any fireworks here. Perhaps only a bit of a retest of the 50-day moving average, a few days above that 50-day moving average before turning down into the declining phase of the cycle and into the cycle low. Next, as requested, let's have a look at coffee. I haven't looked at coffee for quite a while. The previous cycle finished over here at the very end of March, lasting for 79 days. The cycle before that was quite short as well, which followed this significant drop all the way through late last year. Actually, looking at history of different assets, not only coffee, usually after a significant drop where the 50-day moving average declines at a pretty steep angle, there is often a short bounce, giving us a bit of a short cycle only to retest that 50-day moving average before a drop down again into the cycle low. So that's a pretty common occurrence, and those usually give us relatively short cycles. Over the last several months though, we have already seen a couple of short cycles. The previous cycle again lasted for only 79 days, usual is around 110 days. So I think the ongoing cycle will be closer to an average duration, hence it's probably going to continue for another while into mid or late July. So I do expect another retest of this confluence of several resistance zones, including the round number of $200 on coffee futures, as well as this resistance zone that has been respected all the way since 2021 basically. It has been tested and respected multiple times, as you see. And what we also have over here is this longer term downtrend line that has been sort of respected all the way through last year. So this scenario on the screen is probably 70% likely. Again, no fireworks in the next couple of weeks, but perhaps a bit of an upward momentum towards that resistance zone before a drop down into the cycle low. But let me remind you, nobody knows the future. So there is also, I would say, 30% chance that coffee just drops from here all the way down into that cycle low, closer to the average duration, sometime in the second half of July. Looking at optimism index for coffee, it's been pretty elevated over the last several weeks. So again, as I mentioned, while we do have a pretty good chance for one more test of the recent highs, it would also be quite normal for this optimism index to cool down a little bit before pushing any higher in the next cycle rally. And lastly, looking at coffee seasonality, since the beginning of the commodities bull market, that's only since the year 2015, we see that usually late May, that's where we are basically right now, does give us a bit of a local low followed by a bit of an uptrend over the next several weeks. Again, this also supports this more likely scenario of a continued uptrend into that resistance zone over the short term, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks before dropping down into the cycle low. For much more on a range of assets, consider joining us at myfinanceteacher.org, where among the highlights is our recent decision to decrease our allocation to gold that was around mid-May, just before that drop in gold, which follows one of these likely scenarios I mentioned in a recent video. And another highlight that I will discuss perhaps over the next few days is a bit of an update on what's happening to uranium. So consider joining us, stay tuned on YouTube, hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Have a nice day, bye bye.